These are part two of your notes for the Industrial Revolution. Make sure you fill them in and you're prepared to discuss them in class. So we've already talked about transportation, innovations in the factory system. We'll now move on to agriculture and the inventions that transform that part of American society. The first is John Deere's steel plow. The steel plow is going to allow farmers to be able to break up tough soil and be able to plant more efficiently. You'll notice John Deere products are still used to this day in agriculture. And then Cyrus McCormick is going to allow people to harvest more efficiently with the mechanical reaper. And if you go down the spice aisle, you'll see some name brand McCormick spices there even to this day. The effects of the mechanical reaper and the steel plow is that they're going to increase farm production. It also allows the Midwest to focus on farming while the East focuses on manufacturing. So though the Midwest doesn't have the extremely rich and fertile soil of the Deep South, that soil is being used for cotton. In the Midwest, they're going to become the new breadbasket, and that's where a lot of your food production is going to occur. Thanks to the rail systems, they're connected, and so the North can focus on manufacturing, the Midwest can focus on food production, the South can focus on cotton. With that in mind, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin is going to transform the demand for cotton in the Deep South. So the cotton gin makes cotton production more profitable and more efficient. If you've ever seen raw cotton and you're having to separate the seeds from the cotton, it's a very, very tough, tedious, and rough process on the fingers. So the cotton gin allows you to clean the cotton more efficiently. As a result, plantations are going to start to spread westward and increase in size. The negative effect of that is that it increases the demand for slaves and is going to drive Native Americans off their land, as some of that land where Native Americans have resided is now going to be desired for cotton plantations. This leads to some differences in your free blacks and your slaves in American society. Free blacks are not allowed to receive an education. Many are relocated to the North, away from the heavy slaveholding South. They risk being captured and returned to slavery, and they face increased discrimination in the North. So just because the North doesn't have a foundation of relying on slaves so much does not mean that they're welcoming African Americans with open arms to the North either. Slaves are going to be more desired, and slavery expands with the cotton gin. Some slaves are going to resist their owners, and there will be some slave rebellions. They maintain their cultural identity through music, religion, and things of that nature. Many families are separated, as most slave owners do not care much that they're separating mothers from children or wives and husbands. And they're denied basic human rights and punished severely. Obviously denied basic human rights, being that they're in slavery to begin with. Okay, transformations in communication include the telegraph, and that's invented by Samuel Morse, and he's going to have a Morse code that's used on the telegraph in order to transfer communications from one place to another. So telegraph lines are going to go up all over the place, and communication is going to be much more efficient, and it'll spread more rapidly. Immigration in the 1800s is going to be based on different push and pull factors in both America and in Europe in particular. You'll see with the pie chart that a great number of your immigrants are from Ireland, and then next Germany, followed by Great Britain. You have a very small portion that come from Asia, some that come from Canada, a few from Latin America, and a nice little chunk from Europe. Okay. Push factors that are making people leave these areas include population growth, because some areas are overcrowding, agricultural changes in Europe, as many people who may have been able to make a living on some common grounds those common grounds have now been fenced in and property is in the hands of certain people, and so they're not able to do that anymore. Crop failures, particularly the Irish potato famine, which leads to that great number of Irish immigrants. And religious and political conflicts, which is one of the major reasons for people leaving Germany during this time. Pull factors that make them want to come to America include the freedoms that are here, economic opportunity, as there's a lot of land available, especially if you're interested in farming. So again, the Germans come for economic opportunity. They settle in rural and urban areas. The Irish are facing poverty and religious conflict, the potato famine in 1845, and they settle in cities and work on the Erie Canal. Scandinavians, so Northern Europeans, are looking for new economic opportunity, and many of them settle in the Midwest. The Chinese who immigrate, though that's a small number of the immigrants in the 1800s, are going to be working on the Transcontinental Railroad's western portion. So the U.S. population density is heavily in 1810 along the Atlantic coast. See your darker colors here, and much lighter as you go through. And then 10 years later, you'll see it's still very heavily populated along the Atlantic coast. And remember that you have all of these factories that are over here, particularly in the Northeast. And then you see you have a little bit more dense population moving towards the Midwest. Economic differences in the United States are going to lead to sectionalism. This idea that each section is loyal to their area and the economic system that they have, and they want laws to reflect what their economy is based on in their way of life. So the South is going to rely heavily on cotton and slavery. The Northeast is relying on manufacturing and trade and cheap labor. So often they want laws and regulations that are going to assist in that. And the West desires cheap land and good transportation so that they're connected to the Northwest in particular. The impact of slavery on different regions in the United States is going to be different. In the North, for the most part, slavery has been illegal since the American Revolution. You have some abolitionist societies and newspapers that are developed. The Underground Railroad will also be a big part of this region, as there are some people helping escaped slaves or runaway slaves get to the North for safety, and then eventually to Canada for safety. Many had conflicting views about slaves and free blacks, so there is discrimination in the North. The South, the invention of the cotton gin causes plantations to spread, the demand for slave labor increases, and slaves are viewed as property, not as people. It's seen as a crucial part of American, the Southern way of life. It's considered a states' rights issue, and fugitive slaves were a key concern in relations to other states. So you're going to have a push for laws to help slave owners with dealing with their escaped slaves. In the West, they fight constantly over whether or not to extend slavery into the new territories. They want to maintain a balance of free and slave states in the Senate in order to try to avoid conflict, which we all know ultimately will occur with the Civil War. All right, some key court cases occurred during this time frame. They are McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden. The Chief Justice is still John Marshall. Remember, he's appointed by John Adams. He has Federalist beliefs, and he serves for 34 years as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He strengthens the power of the federal government. His cases are going to define the powers of the federal government in general. He has a very broad view of the Constitution, especially with the use of implied powers. In the McCulloch versus Maryland case, they have to determine whether or not a state can tax the federal government. The decision is that states can't tax the federal government. It strengthens the supremacy clause that if a law is in conflict with a federal law, then the federal law is supreme. Okay. It also addresses the issue of implied powers, that implied powers exist, and the uses of the necessary and proper clause. The Gibbons versus Ogden decision is that only the federal government can regulate interstate trade or trade between states, and it strengthens the private property rights and principles of capitalism. We'll do a few activities on these cases so that you get more of the background information for them, but just remember your decisions for your notes. The era of good feelings is from 1816 to 1824. It is a time frame where you have a one-party system, the Democratic Republicans. People have a sense of purpose, a desire for unity, high morale after the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. Things are really looking up for the United States. So there's this new sense of nationalism in the country. In the election of 1816, Monroe wins with 84% of the electoral vote. And you'll see that those years line directly up with this era of good feelings. So the era of good feelings is a time frame in which James Monroe is the president. Henry Clay is an American leader who is going to come up with the American system. He's also known as the Great Compromiser. We'll be discussing him over several units as we continue on through this course. So parts of the American system include the Tariff of 1816, which again, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. We want to improve infrastructure with the money that is raised and the revenue that's raised from this tariff. He wants to address the Second Bank of the United States, which has divided the country, and make internal improvements at the federal expenses, like building a national road to improve transportation systems. The election of 1820, Monroe wins beyond a landslide. It's 99.5% of the electoral vote. So all but one of the votes with 3 people not casting their ballot. All right, domestic problems that come from this time frame are the expansion of the United States. You buy this Louisiana territory, and now each part has to slowly be added to the nation. So states are divided evenly between those who allow slavery and those who didn't. So you must address bringing in Missouri, who has now met all of its requirements to apply for statehood in 1817, and that creates a concern about the shift in the balance of power between slave states and free states. So the Missouri Compromise, which is introduced by Henry Clay, Great Compromiser, in 1820, is for Missouri to enter the United States as a slave state, and then Maine enters as a free state. If you remember way back when we did our colonial map, you had those 2 parts of Massachusetts. So now this is the time when I tell you that now you have Maine. Maine is now separate from being those 2 parts of Massachusetts. So Missouri slave, Maine is free, and then slavery is banned from the rest of the Louisiana Territory for anything north of the 3630 parallel. So anything north of this area has to come in to the United States of America as a free state. If it is south of this 3630 line, it can enter the United States as a slave state. This, for the time being, keeps your balance of power, particularly in the Senate, where your representation is equal for each state. Foreign policy under Monroe is going to include the Monroe Doctrine. You'll remember from Washington up, everyone's tried to remain neutral. So Monroe Doctrine is a policy that European powers should no longer colonize or interfere with the affairs of anyone in America, and that the American continent is forever free and independent from European powers. A lot of this has to do with the fact that many Latin American nations have gained their independence. And what we don't want is for a different European power to come in and say, oh, there's a weak nation over there for me to go take over and colonize. So the impact of the Monroe Doctrine is now we see ourselves as a world power. We are the protector or self-appointed big brother to Latin America. And it's going to influence the foreign policy of later administrations. So with this, we kind of draw this line that across the Atlantic Ocean, Europeans are no longer allowed to have their influence and have their way. We, as the United States of America, will be the big brother to everyone in America, North and South America. Okay. So the quote here is, it is impossible that the European powers should extend their political system to any portion of this continent without endangering our peace and happiness, meaning in the United States. It is impossible that we should behold such involvement with indifference. So we will not just stand and let things happen.